So we have just under 18 minutes for a super, super quick panel discussion. And I think there's a lot here to talk about. You know, governance it's a huge topic. I feel like everyone's talking about it. I haven't seen that much concrete stuff actually come out of it. And, you know, for all of you, you guys have presented a variety of views, everything from self-regulation, self-governance with DAOs and things like that, all the way to the opposite extreme of, well, how do we deal with the governance and compliance and regulatory issues of the pre-existing paradigm today of nation states, right? So my question is, you know, where do you think it's going to go? Are we going to evolve in this place where, you know, we're dealing with the existing laws and regulations and governance systems of nation states today, or do you think it's going to go this opposite direction of decentralized, autonomous organizations? Should we start with you?
I think both will happen, and that there are business opportunities on both extremes. As you know, in the syndicates investments, I like to talk about a U-curve, where you know some of the early market adoptions are more in the dark gray, you know, gray to dark gray to black kind of categories. And that can be a very good, you know, business to run in things that are a little bit beyond the scope of regulation at a given moment, like ICOs were last year. And then over time, as the regulation sort of does, there's a lot of good businesses to be built on the kind of compliance side and fully integrating with the existing systems. But those market opportunities tend to come a little bit later in the cycle. But they also tend to be larger, and in general, they are actually larger, I would say, than on the first side.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're already seeing both things happen, but I also think that if in our self-governance models we don't actually port in principles that are kind of universally recognized, we're going to see government regulation that comes in and essentially makes it very difficult to self-govern, right? And even makes it illegal to self-govern. And that's something that I think would be terrible to see happen. So I think it behooves us when creating self-governance models to really think about, like, what are the basic things that we're seeing various governments and various regulators be concerned with, and they tend to be the same things: fraud prevention, consumer protection, whether you call it accredited investors, or whatever you call it, it's the same basic stuff. So we bake it in, or it's thrust upon us. Those are the options.
Yeah, I think in our space in voting, you've got this concept called liquid democracy, which is, you know, truly a self-governing nation, right? Yeah. On the other extreme, you've got elections officials that are running very regulated voting, right, in elections. And I think a hybrid is going to take place. I think there is an appropriate place for self-governance, liquid democracy outside the context of public elections. That's happening in Russia currently. You've got a housing unit that they meet all the time, so now they're voting on stuff pretty regularly. And I think that's going to happen in some contexts. But I think it's going to be a long, long time because of constitutional frameworks and otherwise. We're going to see truly decentralized governance in a nation-state kind of context.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would echo many of the things that were said here. I think most importantly, you know, I think what a lot of the regulators look at is the things that you were talking about: is how do we provide, you know, consumer protection? How do we ensure that people aren't using it for terrorism financing and money laundering and those other important things? And one of the challenges that we end up in with some of the decentralized applications today is that we don't have the tools yet in place to put those controls in place around those decentralized applications. One of the things I'm actually very excited about going forward is actually us as a community, as an ecosystem, learning our way to apply those controls to these decentralized platforms and resources in a way that don't require outside regulators to try and force them on them. Because I think most of us in the community don't want people being defrauded, right? And don't probably want the funds that are transiting our networks being used to finance terrorism and other things, although I know there's some people in the community that would consider that censorship, and so I know I'm not speaking for everybody. But you know, I think many of us have those same values, but the technology has yet to have a manner by which it can represent those values. And so I'm eager to those tools coming up and being put in place so that we are able to push some of these, for lack of a better term, edgier things like DAOs and other things forward in a way that regulators don't freak out and try and kill, but also that the mass market can feel comfortable entering these frameworks, that they're not just going to get, defrauded and fleeced because they don't understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the entire panel has some consensus that we're going to see this hybrid world in the future. Now, given that, my next question is, who should be involved in this governance discussion? Because I would say, and if you look at the crypto community very closely, I would say technologists have probably been leading the charge, right? You hear these phrases like "code is law," and it makes you wonder. Governance is this issue that we as human beings have been trying to tackle, figure out for millennia. Is this as simple as code is law and we can code everything? Anyone?
I will say that at some level it is that simple, and here's the reason why. We talked about mutability, changeability. Existing legal systems are not mutable. They evolve with grafting on additional things, and code can be rewritten, it can be changed, and so even if it's broken at any given moment, it can be fixed. And I think that's why I'm very optimistic about the actual growth and evolution in this area.
I disagree. I'm a lawyer by training, and so I actually think the law is quite mutable. I think it's designed to be mutable. I just think it takes a really long time. And I think that the speed and pace of law and regulation is a source of frustration in tech, which I completely understand because I'm also a technologist, so I see both sides of that. But the reality is that the process that a law generally, not in all countries, goes through in order to be realized as actual, codified law or as case law or whatever it looks like, is designed in theory, in the United States, to be quite inclusive. And I would argue that we're not considering a broad enough community at all, and that's going to be very much to the detriment of self-governance systems if we are not being inclusive and thinking about who we're actually building with, and not just trying to shove these models into the space in a way that isn't considering the regulatory priorities, which are pretty clear at this point. Again, I'll just keep saying the same thing, but I feel like if we don't kind of give credit and credence to these very pretty clearly at this point defined general principles that we're seeing be important around the world, it is entirely possible that something like a DAO would just become illegal. It would not be that hard to issue regulation to make that something you just couldn't do. And I think that would be a huge, huge loss.
I think we're going through the same cycle that we've gone through in Web.1 and Web 2.0, which was you had the technologists lead the charge, right? And they tried to do this, I call it a frontal attack of disrupting some industry, whether it's retail, e-commerce, whatever it is. And eventually they run into regulations, they run into law, and then they run into enterprises and these industry structures that you can't just disrupt overnight, that you either have to figure out a way to work within those confines, right, or a legacy system, or you just get, you're just gone. And so that happened in Web.1, Web.2.0, and I think the same thing's happening here. And you tend to get, when money starts to get attracted to something, that stuff starts to happen. So I think we're just on the cusp of that happening. And so right now it's not been inclusive at all. The regulators are forcing inclusion, right? And then as industry really starts to, if we see enterprises and governments really start to take a hold of this technology, I think then that inclusiveness is going to be forced on the technologists, right, a little bit. And I think we'll evolve from there.
I'd also add, I agree with the two of you and concur as well to your point in how this all comes together from the standpoint of integration. But to add another layer to the collective points made, I think it's really important that as someone that works with the SEC on many issues, worked on issues of net neutrality and it's watching this build out. But the point I want to drive home is it's going to be from the standpoint of the regulator, particularly in the middle and upper level of vertical integration within the SEC and some of the other agencies, is education. And that is where we focus on and kind of eliminating some of the misnomers to counterbalance some of the challenging things that are happening that we see in this ethos.
So I want to dovetail on these 2 points here because I think they're really important. You talked about educating regulators and making sure that they are included in the conversation, and you just talked about, Internet 1.0, there were a lot of issues there, and ultimately what came out of it, was probably not what a lot of us were hoping for. I mean, today, even if you just look at privacy policy, right? Like, a lot of us don't own our own data, and I think a lot of us aren't so happy about that. What needs to happen to make sure that this blockchain revolution results in policy making that is actually, that goes towards what we actually intend it for, as opposed to like, oh, a few companies now own all our data and all this other stuff?
So, I mean, from my perspective, I think there's, a couple of things about that. I was lucky enough that I got to be part of the early internet and go through that phase as well. And,
I didn't think you were that old.
Yeah. And I can tell you it's an honor to be able to do that with blockchain again. And I would say the one difference in perspective, I say, going through it a second time was the first time we knew we were changing the world. I would say that the second time, one of the things I'm particularly focused on is the fact that every decision that we make is creating the future that we're all going to live in. And so we need to be really thoughtful in particular about what the long-term consequences of our decisions are. Right, and so, one of the sort of negative examples I would give of that from the early internet, a lot of what I did was on the backbone side. All of us knew the best practice was to encrypt all the data at the transport layer, but we had other scalability issues and everything else, and we mostly trusted each other at the network layer, so we weren't going to really snoop on that data anyway. And, what that did by not holding that value from the very beginning is it opened the door to warrantless wiretapping online and all those other things where, had we thought about the potential repercussions of that decision and maybe gone a different way, maybe there would have been other negative, repercussions of making a different decision, but we may have not ended up where we are. And so I would just say it's important for all of us that are working in this space to realize that we're creating the future, and that a shortcut that we create now that makes it easier for us to get to the next step may have long-term consequences that are beyond what we thought that they were at the time. And so we need to be really conscious of that while we're making those decisions.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I'd say to tie into that too, I mean, the original vision of Satoshi, whoever she is, right, was micropayments for the people, right? Truly decentralized. Let's lift up the unbanked, and I'm not sure that's happening anymore. That's my biggest fear kind of going forward, that as an industry, we're going to forget about that original vision that these individuals had, and it's going to become, blockchain for enterprise, and the profit makers take over, right? And I think in addition to, kind of keeping the spirit of making it secure, making it individual, you own your own data, you give up data when you want, is also taking the 1.1 or 1.8 billion people that are unbanked, that have no identity. Like, this is the phenomenal technology to bring these people into the world, right? And I just hope that as an industry, we don't forget that part, and we really execute on that effectively.
Totally agree. I think the frustration and the irony is that the regulators are the ones kind of pushing us back to that original vision, right? I mean, it's really a shame. I mean, that's where this started. And we're moving further and further away from that. And the weight of the media attention and everything else is pulling us further and further as a community away from that. And it takes a lot of effort to be, it's hard to be inclusive. It's easy to move fast with a small group of people and kind of move in a direction and get things done and be reactive to what you see as, like, again, the big gorilla coming in and telling you can't go that direction, you got to go this direction, But I absolutely take your point, because I think this is the time. Like, this really, really, really is the time. It was the time a year ago. It was the time 4 years ago. It's really the time now to sit back, take a step back, and really think about long-term consequences here, and what we're giving up by the direction that we're letting this go without putting a little bit of boundary around it.
I agree with you. One other point I'd like to make, we talk about the SEC, we talk about some of the other commodity futures trading commission, we talk about this area. But one oversight I think that we haven't spoken about, who's going to really weigh in on this issue, and maybe be the final gavel, and I think that's going to be the U.S. Treasury. I've had the opportunity to speak with the Secretary of Treasury, and his emphasis on how this should be shaped is going to really weigh on Treasury. And I think there's a couple steps to get to that, but please be cognizant of the U.S. Treasury as well.
I just want to echo something Justin said earlier that I think is relevant to this, is that I think it's a good time for the community to come together and find their own way of setting the principles in place and the accountability structures in place. There are some really good efforts going on in the community right now along those lines. Here in San Francisco, there's a great group working on sort of ICO governance or project governance that builds on the legacy of open source governance and other things that have been set up. And I think we have a good case, even within some of the members of that group, to set up a new governance model for foundations that is compliant and integrated with sort of the best features of what's come before. So I'm still very optimistic that there are those core intentions and vision that was foundational in other open source movements that is continuing on today.
So on the topic of inclusivity in the governance process, Jewel, you mentioned in your presentation this idea about incentivizing community members, right? So my question, and I extend this to all of you, is how do we incentivize good decision making? Because I see a lot of these token models, and it's like, oh, vote and swipe left for this or right for this, and if it's as simple as that, human behavior is such that you game the system and you're just swiping for the sake of owning tokens or whatever it might be. How do we incentivize good governance, good decision making from community members?
I'm a huge fan of staking models in general that forces people to have a longer term outlook. Elastos is presenting at a meetup later today. They have a really good staking model. I think that's something where also sort of minimum limit so that there is a level of inclusiveness, but people have to have some kind of long-term stake in that, and that forces them to invest the time and energy that it is to really understand the issues that are involved rather than just the kind of swiping mentality, which sometimes can be net destructive.
I'm not sure there's an answer to that. There's no solution, right? A good decision for you might be a bad decision for me, right? And for political reasons or otherwise. So I think good decision making is incredibly subjective, right? And the level of information, we talked about this backstage, about an informed decision versus an uninformed, or incentives that maybe make you make a decision versus another one. I don't know if that's a solvable thing, truthfully.
I think the best you can hope to do is put into place a process that's defensible.
Yeah.
Like have a process, stick to the process, be consistent, have a mechanism for modifying the process when it's not working.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's going to lead to, how do you decide if the outcome is the right outcome? It's tough.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It looks like we are out of time, but
Okay.
thank you so much for being on this panel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.